In the middle of the woods in North Carolina, on a cold January night in 1877, a birth took place that would leave scars on both the body and the mind. The wind shook the pine trees like a restless spirit, and it shook the shutters of a small log cabin that stuck to the side of the mountain. A young mother was in terrible pain inside, under a roof that had been patched with tar and prayer. A small fire burned low, casting a thin glow on the wooden walls. Every shadow seemed to lean forward to see what was going on, about to come into the world. She was hunched over, and her face was scarred from giving birth in the mountains for decades. Her hands were steady, but her heart was racing with worry. She had already given birth to twins. Even though she had buried babies before, what she saw in that cabin that night would make her never speak again. The body of the mother had two children that were joined at the head. Their weak foreheads were joined together so tightly that it looked like they had three faces on one body. There was silence in the room. The dad threw the E. He came in with an axe from cutting down trees for firewood. It made a noise that seemed way too loud as it hit the plank floor. The babies gasped at the same time, then separately, and their cries went up and down in a strange rhythm. One mouth cried out, but the other one was still. Then the cries merged, sounding like they were echoing through each other. Everyone there felt their bones chill when they heard it. But it wasn't the happy cry of life. It was something strange, something that people in the mountains talked about as a watch out. Even though she had never been to church before, the midwife crossed herself. The dad's face was pale and his hands were shaking, but not because he was happy to see his kids being born. He was shaking because he was so scared that it hollowed him out. It was already very scary outside those walls, in the hills. Families who had seen the mother's unnatural swelling while she was pregnant had talked about curses and God marking the mother's bloodlines. Some whispered that such a deformity was proof of sin and a curse on those who had sinned. That would make a whole valley sick, not just one house. Now that the proof was in bloody sheets, the whispers would turn into a roar. The midwife quickly wrapped the babies in a blanket to protect them before the father's shaking hands could reach for them. Even though her mind told her it was impossible, she had no words and only a strong desire to protect. The dad turned away and put his hand on the wall as if to steady himself for a storm. His breath came out in rough pulls. He was quiet, and a question as heavy as stone hung over him. What kind of thing could live with them? This was because in these mountains, mercy did not always mean being kind. The line in these mountains between being kind and being cruel was as thin as the bark on a winter branch. And forces that are already bigger than one, family faith, fear, and the need to stay alive were coming together to decide what would happen to those children. This is how their story starts. A story about two lives that become one, as well as a community that can't speak for fear of being hurt. A minister said it was judgment. A doctor said it was science, and people in the neighborhood said it was danger. What took place in that cabin was only supposed to be known in the holler. It was buried under official records and songs that people only vaguely remembered for decades. But secrets always find a way to get out, no matter how deep they are buried. Stay with me before we go further down this dark path. Sign up now to make sure you don't miss the stories that history tried to hide. Thoughts? Share them as you listen because every voice raised. Against silence helps you remember things. Some stories are too heavy for just one person to tell. When the story started to get around the valley, the cabin still smelled like smoke and iron. By morning, the frost had made the ground hard, and along the ridge, pale smoke curled from chimneys. The surface was quiet, but there was a current of unease running through it. Late in the 1872nd, this was North Carolina, a place that was shaped by stubborn families who didn't use coins to measure wealth but acres of land, in the number of strong hands that can lift a plow, in the kids who lived long enough to have names. Every day, life was a deal with the earth, and the earth often asked for more than it gave. Isolation wasn't just a result of where they lived, it was the way they were. Roads turned into mud in the spring and ice in the winter. It could take 2 days of hard riding to get to the nearest market town, and if it rained, the town might as well have been on another continent. People got by with the things they had. Herbs picked in the woods for fevers, pine resin pus for wounds, and prayers for everything else. Years of harsh winters still made the church bell crack, and the sound could be heard far over the hollers. The sound brought them together when nothing else did, but there was a sharp edge of suspicion in that community even though they sang hymns and shook hands. Anything that wasn't what was expected was looked at with care. A harvest that is too good for you could be a sign of pride. People might whisper that a child who is too slow to speak has been visited by ghosts. Deformity wasn't talked about in the language of medicine, but the language of sin. The Scotch-Irish settlers had brought old stories with them across the ocean. They stuck to the stones like moss. There were tales of Fayorn changelings, witches who cursed families while they were still in the womb, and punishments written on the body by God. The main family in this story had never been very rich. A small garden was scratched out of the slope where the cabin leaned against the edge of the forest. The logs were tightly packed together with clay. The dad worked his land with rough hands and not much else. The mother gave birth to children and raised them in silence. The fact that they weren't very interesting should have kept them safe. But when her belly got bigger than it had ever been during a pregnancy, people started to joke about it. Old women shook their heads and whispered that she was carrying something strange. When she went by, men shrugged and turned their eyes away. By the winter of 1877, that family was already under a lot of stress. The harsh preacher in the area, who had a loud voice, had used the preach to warn people about pride and other hidden sins that would bring judgment from the Lord. People in the church looked in the same direction, even though he never named the family. There was going to be a birth, and with it, a reckoning. So, when the kids showed up and their fused skulls turned rumors into things that could be seen, the town didn't be shocked. A baby was thought to be a blessing, a sign that life would go on even when things got hard. But these babies didn't want that comfort. Their existence alone put the balance of faith that kept the community together in a world that sometimes seemed cruel. What did it say about God's plan if he could let that happen? Who was to blame if it wasn't God? People thought the answers would not be nice. It was always up to the holler to keep order in it. There was no court nearby and no sheriff that was easy to get in touch with. Men instead got together in back rooms. Women looked at each other at quilting circles and decided what was okay and what had to be kept secret. What needs to be erased. People from outside the town were not allowed to know about their problems, for fear that the town would be made fun of, invaded, or spied on. There was a heavy silence that the twins had made themselves, like the snow on the pine trees. It would soon close in on them like a shroud. The father stood in the yard and stared at the ridge the night after the birth, while the mother lay in bed sick and weak. The cold made his breath cloudy, and his hands were clenched. The loud, thin cries coming from inside broke through the walls, a sound that went through. In the middle of the mountain night, it was very quiet. As people in the neighborhood listened, lanterns lit up in faraway windows. Some people crossed their arms, others said prayers in their heads, and some, who were more scared than religious, started to think about what they needed to do. The stage was set for both a family's private tragedy and a decision made by the whole community. Because in Stillwater and other hollows like it, survival wasn't based on kindness, but on following the rules. The kids were now grown up. As for whether they would be able to, Their parents were no longer the only ones who could save their lives. The only window in the cabin didn't let in much light. Only a gray smudge of morning light came through. The mother was inside, lying on a pile of quilts. Her skin was pale, and her hair was wet with sweat that had turned cold. She gave up everything to have the babies, and now she clung to life with the weak will of someone who knows they have more to lose than blood. Her eyes, which were half lit but fierce when they opened, always looked around. For the sound of her babies. For her, they weren't mistakes, punishments, or bad signs. They belonged to her. She had been getting ready for months in small ways that her neighbors thought were silly, but she really believed in them. As her needle flashed in the dim light of oil lamps, she sewed 2 sets of tiny clothes while singing old lullabies. She had talked to them late at night and told them stories that only she could make up, even when her body grew in a strange way and her back hurt so much. She whispered promises to the life inside her so badly that she could hardly stand. Now, even though she was tired and had a fever, she listened for their cries with a tenderness that went against everything the outside world told her to do. The dad stood by the fireplace and was as quiet as a rock. He was a hard worker, and his back was hunched from tilling fields that only gave him enough food to stay alive. It wasn't always easy for him to find the right words, but now it wasn't just him who was quiet. Nature, it was a wall between him and the fear that was building up. However, he did not see children in the wrapped package like his wife did. He saw the verdict. He could see his neighbor's eyes going deep into the walls of his cabin. He looked at the preacher and saw that he was already practicing his speech about sin taking the form of flesh. More than anything else, he saw his own weakness. He might be blamed for not protecting his family from an unseen curse. The midwife, who was sitting in the corner, wrung her hands together as if she were washing them. Water you can't see. Even though she looked tired, something worse was showing in her eyes. Feeling guilty, she had helped bring many babies into the world, been there for mothers who were bleeding on the bed, and buried stillborn babies herself when no one else could. But she had never seen a birth like this before. She meant to write it down and give it a name in her ledger, but her pencil was shaking and scratching across the page without making any words. How can you show both horror and innocence at the same time? Take a deep breath. She knew that people would want her to keep quiet, and she was already ready to do it. For hours after they were born, the babies wouldn't be quiet. Through the cracks in the cabin, thin, sharp wails came in. They went down the hollow into the ears of people who lived in houses spread out along the ridge at night. Dogs made noise. Men got out of bed. Women put their hands over the ears of their kids. That the cries were louder than any babies wasn't the point. The fact that they seemed to come. From more than one mouth and more than one place, as if voices were mixing in a way that doesn't make sense. The brothers of the father, who lived a mile down the hill, were the first ones to call. As they walked in, their faces were grim, and their eyes kept moving to the cradle but never quite landed on it. Someone said in a low voice that something like that couldn't be allowed to breathe. Even though he didn't say anything, the other man's silence was stronger than any words. The dad didn't say much back. His wife grabbed the bundle tighter and glared at him with a fierce look. Her body was no longer hers. The brothers didn't touch the kids as they left, but the message was clear. This could not be left up to the family to handle on their own. Sneers turned into talk, and talk quickly turned into judgment. The preacher was called, but the mother begged him to stay away. This man came in with a black Bible under his arm. His voice shook the small cabin like a hammer. He talked about God's punishment, sins that are passed down through families, and mercy that sometimes meant ending pain before it started. It was the dad's. It made their heads drop with every word. Even though she was cold and pale, the mother looked at the preacher and said only one thing. They belong to me. But what the preacher said wasn't for her. They were for the father, the men who would soon gather in the storehouse, and the women who talked quietly by the wells. Outside the cabin walls, decisions were already being made. Even if the father didn't want to, his silence made him a part of what was going on. The mom's defiance was pointless now, no matter how hard she looked, and the midwife, who was torn between duty and fear, knew that the baby's fate was no longer in the hands of the people who had given birth to them. That night, when the mother fell asleep with a fever, the father went outside again. He turned on his lantern and looked out over the snowy valley. In faraway windows, shadows moved. He was aware that they were seeing. He knew they were coming soon, but not to watch, but to decide. As soon as the birth was over, the blood was cleaned up, and cries filled the room. The real horror of what had come into the world became clear. The babies were not just twins who were tied together. They were two different kids, but their skulls were joined together in a weird way that made their foreheads and brows look like they were joined together. Looking at them from certain angles, their tiny faces looked like three heads were growing out of one weak body. Their eyes opened at different times. One pair slowly blinked while the other rolled up in pain. Both mouths gasped and whimpered, and then, as if a ghost were there, echo, they both cried at the same time. Their cries mixed and matched, making a noise that no one in the cabin could mistake for a healthy whale giving birth. Someone with hardened ears would get scared at that sound. When the father heard it, he turned away and put his palms over his temples, as if to block out the sound that didn't come from his body, but from something deeper. Even though the midwife had been working as one for decades, she couldn't catch her breath. She had brought kids into the world who had bendy limbs, pursed lips, or bodies that were too weak to last the night. She had quietly cried as she watched the small coffins be lowered into the ground. But this was different from anything else she had seen. She whispered the names of saints that she didn't really believe in, grasping for any word that would help her calm down. Even though she was weak and shaking, the mother reached out her arms in desperation. She held the wrapped bundle close and didn't notice that it had an odd shape underneath the cloth. It was warm. They were moving slowly, and their weak breath was touching her skin. She chose to see life instead of monsters. She put her lips to their crowns, where the bones had joined together, as if her love were the only thing that could make them into something that the world could accept. But the snow outside the cabin made it too loud. The cries went through the cold, brittle air, down the hollow, and back up over the frozen water. People were shaking in their beds because of the noise. The kids asked what kind of animal could make those sounds. Parents told them to be quiet and pulled the blankets closer around them. Among the older people in the valley, the whispers turned into solid truths. This wasn't a present. It was a letter. The story was already taking shape by dawn. Some people said that the children had the mark of the devil and that the mother had sinned behind their backs. Some people said that the father's blood was cursed and that the curse had finally shown itself. And the ending was always the same, no matter how it was told. It was not possible for those kids to stay. The look of three heads became the sign in every story that was told in secret. People said that when the babies turned around, it looked like their cries came from more mouths than faces. The people there said that the lantern light made their fused skull look like a scary crown. People thought the babies were more than just physically flawed. The fact that they lived was a sign that the valley would suffer. The mother didn't hear what was being said. She was focused on her own battle, holding on to life and building up what strength she had left to protect her children. The father heard them, though. It was impossible for him to leave his house without feeling like many eyes were on him, and that judgment was already starting to form. His silence, which was once a shield, turned into a chain. He sat by the fire that morning and stared at the axe he had left against the wall. The old resin on the handle was smooth from years of use. It had cut down trees, cleared land, and built the walls of the cabin itself. After all that, his neighbors thought it should do something else. The sobs, the uneven, haunting sounds of the babies filled the silence. The dad was sure the sound would not go away, not from the house, the valley, or his heart. The cries could not be kept inside the cabin. They spread out across the ridge, making people feel uneasy about something that wasn't natural. The strange overlapping voices of the babies became a chorus that no one could ignore in a valley where sound spread like rumor. In just one day, every home within miles had heard the story. Some came from their own ears, and others were whispers that spread faster than springtime river thaw. Fear was what people there talked about. It held on to them tighter than the cold winter air. Men said they knew what the kids looked like even though they had never seen them. Women, who had only heard the faintest sounds of wails, said they were demons' cries. Each time a story was told, it changed. At first, there were 2 babies whose skulls were fused together. Soon, there were 3 heads on one body, something that looked in more than one direction at the same time. It was a sign that no family could handle living in it. Old stories came back to life. Stories that came from Europe were changed in the dark Appalachians. Some people said that the mountain had given birth to its spirit through the children, a forest demon that would bad things happen to crops and animals. Some people said the mother had been cursed by a witch and that her womb had turned into a punishment vessel. Behind closed doors, people talked about the 3-headed child of their words were always filled with fear and emptiness. The story became more clear to the older people. From the pulpit, the preacher yelled about what happens when you sin, but he never named the family by name. His flock knew without being told. They sat stiffly in their pews, looking back and forth between each other. They agreed in their silence that something had to be done. The preacher's words were like nails driven into wood. They shook the air. Not being able to walk straight was not a test, it was a judgment, and judgments need answers. Kids talked quietly among. They were telling each other they would dare to sneak up on the cabin at night to hear the cries. Some said they saw shadows moving inside, but they weren't babies. They said they saw the shadows of something bigger, twisting, and having too many faces. Some people said they had seen tracks in the snow that didn't look like they came from an animal they knew. The truth didn't really matter. With each story, belief grew stronger. As the dad walked to get water from the frozen creek, he could feel kids' eyes on him. Their greetings were not as long. Their words were cut off. He carried heavy buckets with him, ice, but the silence of the people who used to call him brother and friend was even worse. The mother was too weak to get out of bed, so she felt alone because she wasn't there. There was no woman with soup or kids to play with her sons. The cabin was now a place where people went to hide their shame, not their illness. By the 2nd week, the rumors had turned into something more like the law. Men gathered in the back of the general store. They spoke softly but firmly. They talked about how dangerous it would be to let the babies live, of how people from outside the area might hear and make fun of or look into it. One man told an old story about a ghost with 3 heads that lived in the woods and whose cry meant death. "It is here again," he said in a shaking voice, "and we must answer it." That's how the story of the 3-headed child went from being about a birth to being about a curse. The valley no longer saw 2 weak and human babies struggling. There was a threat that they couldn't let grow that they saw in the flesh. There was already fear to clear the way for them to act. Soon, that fear would call for blood. It was late on Sunday, and the church bell rang. The voice of the broken iron bell shook through the cold air. People walked into the wooden building with serious looks on their faces, leaving slick marks on the floors with their boots. The preacher stood at the front of the church with one hand on his Bible and the other raised high. He didn't have to say why they were all there. Everyone knew. They could hear the cries coming from the cabin. All of them, and what they had heard at night, needed an answer today. The Bible came first in his sermon, the familiar beat of the Psalms and the prophets' warnings. But as his voice got louder, the verses turned into weapons. He talked about babies being born as signs of evil, and bodies being twisted not by chance but by God's justice. His words made the babies sound like they were not souls that needed care, but proof of sin that was too great to ignore. He yelled, "God marks the wicked, and when he does, we have to clean our homes so that his destroy us all with wrath." The people in the congregation moved around uncomfortably on their benches. Mothers held their kids closer, and dads stared up at the rough who-need beams above. No one dared to speak, but there was a smell in the silence. What people talked about in kitchens and along fences became holy law because of the preacher. The strange babies were no longer a private problem. For many, they had become a test of faith. The kid's dad sat in the back with his shoulders hunched. The man didn't want to come, but he had to because the preacher had called him. Every word was like iron pressing down on him. He could feel his neighbor's eyes on him and the accusations he made in their stares. Even though his wife clung to the babies like a mother, he could feel his resolve weakening. What chance did her love have against the whole church rising up? The preacher had an even bigger impact on people outside of church. He talked to the elders alone, and his voice was now calm, no longer thundering but beckoning. He told them it was their job to keep the hollow safe, and about the shame that would come if other people found out what had been born among them. He said that everyone would call us stupid, but God calls us good people when we follow his rules. He set the stage for what the council of men would soon decide with those words. At night, his shadow crossed the door of the cabin, but he didn't come to comfort. He came to lead. From the front door, he told the father that mercy. Sometimes it meant to take action, like letting those kids live was the same thing as condemning them to be teased and abused. I thought it was kindness, but his eyes were so sure of it that I couldn't feel sorry for him. The dad agreed, but he couldn't say anything because his throat was so dry. She turned her pale face away from him in bed and prayed in a way that no one could hear. Every night when the preacher went home, he knew that his job was almost done. Doctrine was made out of fear, and fear was stronger than stone. As soon as the elders got together, there would be nothing left to argue about. When the doctor got there was still snow along the edges of the mountain paths. He wasn't as old as most people thought, maybe 30 years old. His coat was dirty from travel, and his boots were stuck in frozen mud. He had gone to school in Raleigh, and his voice had a school-trained sound that didn't fit in the hollow. The preacher spoke with a voice like thunder and fire, but this man spoke slowly and clearly, as if he were a priest. Reading from a medical book. He walked into the cabin without much of a fuss. With shame and reluctance, the father moved out of the way, and the mother tightened her grip on the bundled babies. It wasn't clear to the doctor. He leaned over, moved the cloth, and held the lantern up so the kids' faces could be seen. Not out of fear, but out of calculation, his eyes got narrow. He looked at the fused skull, the strange symmetry of the brows and foreheads pressed together, and the effect that 3 heads were coming out of one body, where other people had gasped or crossed their arms. He did nothing but frown and grab his notebook. His pencil scratched quickly, leaving lines of thought all over the page. He wrote that the cranium and face meet at the frontal bones. There are likely 2 separate brains there. Separate neural function is confirmed by 2 cries. He spoke to himself in a low voice, prognosis non-viable, noticing that one twin was stronger than the other, the different speeds of their breaths. To him, they were not kids. They were specimens, rare oddities that had to be written down. And learned. The mother was furious and kept quiet. She tried to speak out against it in a whisper, but her voice was too weak to be heard over his steady reading. It made the dad feel bad that he couldn't say anything. The midwife, who was standing in the dark, made fists with her apron. She thought the doctor would be horrified, sorry, or even disgusted. She wasn't ready for detachment to be so cold that it felt like another kind of cruelty. The doctor put his notes in his case and folded them up before he left. He told the father made it clear that these kids would not last long and that letting them stay would only cause them more pain. He talked about mercy in terms of science, like how to end quickly and keep deformity from turning into a show. He told them that if outsiders found out about the kids, they would be laughed at or used for money. Better, he said, to make sure they died quietly and their bodies were buried deep. When he left, the snow covered the sound of his horse's hooves, but his words stayed in the air. Now the doctor had given scientific proof, and the preacher had given religious justification. Between the two, the path was almost sealed. That night, the father sat by the fire with his head in his hands. His wife lay in bed with the babies, rocking them gently even though they were crying at different times. In the glow of the flames, their faces looked almost calm and normal, but the father could still hear the preacher's thunder and see the doctor's notes in his mind. There was a council meeting in the back room of the general store. This was how they always did it when they had to make a decision about something too important to talk about openly. The shelves smelled like molasses and kerosene, and the lanterns cast long shadows on the barrels of flour and nails. 5 men sat together: the preacher, the storekeeper, the blacksmith, the miller, and the landowner, whose acres stretched the farthest across the valley. Power had aged them faster than years ever could. First, the preacher explained what was going on. His voice was steady, and his knowledge of the Bible was as sharp as ever. He repeated what he had said in church. The children were a sign, and signs should not be ignored. Next, the doctor's letter was read. It was written in neat script, and it said that the babies would not survive. His words were cloaked in the language of medical inevitability. The case was already closed between the preacher and the doctor. He said that outsiders would take such a story and make fun of it, or, worse, be interested in it. The hollow would turn into a circus. The blacksmith clenched his fists and muttered about curses spreading through bloodlines and the danger to their own children if such a deformity were allowed to stay. The miller just shook his head and said that mercy was best shown quickly, before memory set in too deeply. They didn't argue for long. They had done this before, but never with such a show. Families with children born. There were unspoken rules that things that were too strange, too dangerous, or too embarrassing would not be allowed to grow. The lie that followed would be carefully woven, as tight as the weave in a winter quilt. This time, the story would be simple. The babies had been stillborn, and the mother's fever would take her soon after. This would explain why the family was quiet. The father would be pied, but not really. The men were not to blame. The graves would be dug, the records would be carefully written, and the truth would be buried in both earth and ink. When the meeting was over, the men got up one by one, each nodding in the sleepy way that people do when they think they are doing what is best for everyone. They walked out into the winter night, their lanterns bobbing through the snow, and the faint smell of kerosene lingered behind them, a reminder of their decision. Back at the cabin, the father felt the noose of fate tighten around him. He hadn't said anything at the council, but he knew what was going to happen. When he got home, his wife was weakly humming to the babies, her cracked lips pressing against their fused brows. She looked up at him with eyes that still held hope, and he couldn't bring himself to tell her what had happened. Outside, the snow covered everything except the babies' thin cries. Soon, even those would be muffled by the careful writing of death records, and the low scratch of shovels on frozen ground. The snow was falling harder than he remembered. A 9-year-old boy slipped out into the storm from a cabin not far down the hollow. His father had gone to the store for the council meeting and his mother was sick, so he was bored, curious, and eager to explore. He had been told not to go too far, but kids are naturally eager to explore. He walked through the drifts with his lantern bobbing in the dark until he saw other lights. Moving slowly through the woods, where no one should have been, the lamps swinging like willow branches in the snow. The boy ducked behind the trunk of a big oak tree and held his breath as the men got closer. He recognized them, his own father was among them, and knew that their names meant something. They were carrying something heavy between them, a long, narrow bundle wrapped in burlap that looked like a child being wrapped in a blanket. The boy pressed his mittened hands to his mouth, his heart pounding against his. Ribs, the men moved to a clearing where the ground had been softened by earlier digging, and there they set the bundle down. The preacher knelt and muttered words that were not like the prayers the boy had heard in church. His tone was harsh, clipped, almost pleading. The others shifted uneasily, their lantern light flickering against the snow. Then, as they bent low to cover the bundle with earth, the boy heard a sound that rooted him to the spot. A cry, thin, muffled, unmistakable. The cry of something alive was inside the burlap. It wasn't an animal's cry or the wind scream through the trees. It was the wail of an infant struggling for air. The boy's stomach turned to ice, and he wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't let him. He could only watch as his father and the others shoveled dirt over the bundle, their grim faces and steaming breaths in the cold air. The cries got weaker, then stopped, and the preacher's muttering came to an end. One by one, the men stood and brushed the bundle, the dirt from their hands. They looked around the clearing as though expecting to be watched, but the snow kept its secrets. Satisfied, they turned back toward the path, their lantern swinging once more through the storm. The boy crouched, trembling behind the oak until they were gone. Then he stumbled home, half frozen, his teeth chattering not from the cold but from the horror etched into his memory. That night, fever consumed him, and when he babbled to his mother of cries from the earth and lights in the trees, she told him it. It was only a dream, but sometimes kids' dreams hold truths that are too heavy for adults to handle. The boy would carry that sound, the muffled cry below the ground, as a wound that no prayer could heal. The snow eventually melted, but the silence that it left behind did not ease. What the council had buried did not stay still in the minds of the people. Rumors spread through the hollow like thawing streams, twisting and multiplying as they went. Soon, the truth was buried beneath layers of rumors, each one. People in the area said they heard strange cries at night coming from the burial ground. Men said they heard the faint wail of an infant being carried through the pines, even though there wasn't a cradle in that part of the valley. Women said their dogs barked and whined when they came close to the Hilton plot and wouldn't put their paws on the ground. Some said the earth itself moved there, as if it were unsteady under its thin blanket of grass. Children took in the fear and changed how they played, it in their own way. They scratched crude drawings in the dirt figures with 3 heads stacked upon one another, or creatures with too many eyes staring in every direction. They dared one another to venture close to the cemetery after dusk, to press their ears to the frozen soil and listen. Some came back pale and silent, unable or unwilling to say what they had heard. Others invented wild tales of clawing hands breaking through the earth. The story grew legs. Soon, the 3-headed infants were no longer. Farmers blamed failed crops on their restless spirits. A stillborn calf was said to carry their curse. A fire that gutted a shed was said to be the punishment of the 3-headed child. Fear, which used to be based on flesh and bone, had turned into a story. The father felt this every time he left his cabin. No one directly accused him, but every look carried suspicion. His axe shook in his hands and wouldn't stay still for splitting wood. He had never missed church before. Now that he knew what had happened under the snow, and the preacher's loud voice was still playing in his head, he couldn't bring himself to go inside. The mother stayed in her bed, her strength fading. Her eyes were hollow from fever and grief. She whispered names she had chosen that would never be recorded, and grabbed the air as if reaching for children she still thought were nearby. She heard the rumors, too, though no one said them out loud in her presence. Her silence wasn't acceptance. It was the silence of A. It broke the woman's heart to know what other people had done to her blood. In the hollow, the story of the three-headed child took root deeper than any truth could. The cries at night could have been caused by wind or the shifting earth, or even just frost breaking the ground. But the people thought it was scary, and once they believed it, it became law. By late spring, when the snow had melted and the creeks were full of water from the melting snow, the rumors were loud enough to reach the county seat. Officials there, a sheriff, was sent to the hollow because of rumors of strange births and disappearances. His visit was called routine census work, tax rolls, and the checking of stills rumored to be hidden in the woods, but everyone knew the real reason. The story of the three-headed babies had spread further than the council had intended, and now a man in uniform would be asking questions. The sheriff arrived on horseback, his coat patched and his badge dulled from years of use. He wasn't a fool. He had seen things. But he had also learned to read silences and figure out how uneasy people were by looking into their eyes. He started by going to the cabin, where the father stood stiff and tired. The man's hands shook as he talked about how hard it was for his wife to give birth. His voice caught when he talked about how the stillborn twins were buried behind the cabin in the family plot, as was the custom. He said that his wife had followed them soon after, carrying a fever through the night. Though he never took his eyes off the floor, his words didn't waver, and his voice sounded like it was memorized rather than real. But the sheriff didn't write anything down. Next, the midwife was called. She showed her ledger, with each entry neat and careful. The page for February had a note of sadness on it. Twin girls stillborn, malformed. Mother died 3 days later. The Lord's will be done. Her handwriting was steady, and her tears were timed perfectly. She talked about professional discretion that some details were too cruel to record. Her words rang rehearsed, but they were cloaked in the authority of her role, and the sheriff could not easily challenge them. At the church, the preacher welcomed the sheriff with booming hospitality. A community supper was prepared, hymns sung in his honor. He spoke freely of the tragedies that visited the hollow that winter, of the Hilton mother lost to fever, of her poor husband, now widowed and broken. He gestured to the graves, freshly marked and neat. His voice carried conviction. He looked at the other sheriffs without any doubt. The sheriff went to the burial site himself and saw the graves, which were mounded and marked with crude wooden crosses. The ground had been disturbed recently, but that could mean anything in the thawing spring earth. He stood there for a long time, listening to the wind blow through the pines, but the soil didn't tell him anything. When he got back to the county seat, he had a simple report. 2 babies had died in birth, and a mother had died of fever. He wrote in one line that residents seemed unusually unwilling to talk about the issue, but without proof he could not go any further. The file was closed, put in a drawer, and soon forgotten by everyone except those who lived with the silence. For the people of the hollow, the sheriff's departure was both a relief and a warning. They had passed their first test. Outsiders had come and gone without taking anything away. Their story held, but their secret remained. But secrets, like graves, tend to sink. Even though the official report was turned in and the sheriff's horse had been driven out of the valley for a long time, peace did not return to the Hilton cabin. Inside those walls, sadness and silence lingered like smoke that would not clear. The mother, who was sick and grieving, slipped deeper into the shadows of her mind every day. She grabbed the quilts and whispered names that no one else could hear, the names she had chosen for her daughters that would never be written down. The next night, she woke up shaking and reaching for them as if they were still lying next to her. She made lullabies with her lips, but her voice was cracked and hollow, as if she sang into nothingness. Her body got weaker until she could barely get out of bed. The fever came back in waves, and by the second spring, she was dead. Her death was added to the official story of giving birth and getting an infection. The valley mourned her in silence, but their sadness was mixed with relief. For the council, her absence took away the last voice that had dared to speak out against the government. Father remained hollowed by loss. He walked the yard with shoulders bent, his eyes distant. The axe that had once been an extension of his arm now shook in his grip. He could no longer split wood without fumbling. Some said his hands trembled because of grief. Others whispered it was the weight of what he had allowed to be done. He withdrew from the church, never again stepping across its threshold. On Sundays he sat alone on the porch, staring at the ridge, listening to echoes only he could hear. Parents were not the only ones with deep scars. The 3 sons who were sent to a neighbor's cabin on the night their sisters were buried were also scarred. They were too young to understand, but kids take in truth in ways that adults can't. The oldest boy, who was only 7 at the time, started to stutter. He used to be very talkative and lively, but now each word felt like it had too much weight to push past his lips. His classmates learned to wait patiently for him to finish. Some people didn't talk to him at all, and his silence spoke louder than any accusation. The middle child, who was only 5 years old, started to walk while he was sleeping. At first, it was just a harmless wandering with his bare feet stomping across the cabin floor. But soon, his steps took him outside to the small cemetery behind the house, where his father often found him stomping on the ground with his small hands, dirt packed under his nails, and mouth whispering in his sleep. When he was woken up, he didn't remember. At night, he dug, leaving stains on the sheets, and rumors spread that he wanted to find what the council had buried. The youngest, who was still a toddler, talked to people he thought no one else could see. He made extra seats at the table because he insisted that 2 sisters needed food. He sang lullabies to empty corners, his small voice rising in tunes that his mother used to sing. He described them with shocking clarity. 2 girls stuck together who can't go to heaven. His words scared his father to silence while the hollow watched the boys with wary eyes. Some said the kids carried their mother's grief. Others whispered of curses and sins passed down through blood, but no one dared speak out loud because they would risk tearing open the grave the council had sealed. So the family was left to their silence, each member carrying their mother's grief. Years went by, but the shadows cast in 1877 did not go away. The hollow chose silence, but another record lived on in ink and bone. The young doctor who had visited the cabin came back to his town with more than just words. He added notes about the case to his study, among the medical books and jars of preserved specimens, making sure that no names were used, but the details were clear. In his journal, he wrote with clinical precision. Unusual skull-to-face union seen in rural North Carolina on February 1, 877. 2 skulls fused at the frontal bone. Independent crying confirms dual neural pathways. Prognosis terminal. No intervention necessary. To him, it wasn't a tragedy. It was a discovery. He talked of mercy only in terms of procedure, never of compassion. His pen turned a night of pain into a neat entry in the annals of abnormality. Decades later, when his things were sold after his death, a box was found in one of them. He kept old notebooks and a small skull sealed in waxed cloth in the attic of his house. The label on the skull, written in faded ink, simply said, Craniofacial Specimen, Carolina 1877. The bone was weak, but the fusion at the brows was clear. A fracture line showed where sharp force had separated what nature had joined. Medical students who studied the collection disagreed on what it meant. Some saw it as proof of early pathology, while others thought it showed the doctor's morbid fascination with death. Not many people thought about the person who had made the object. For them, it was just an interesting thing to study, record, and pass around like a relic. The cries that had once filled the cabin were not in their notes. The grief of a mother, the shaking of a father, and the silence of a valley were not there. But the skull did not rest quietly. Over the years, rumors spread in the medical school hallways about a specimen that seemed to carry unease with it, a relic that students didn't like to handle for long. Some people said the broken bones made them think of violence, while others said the eye's empty sockets fused together in an unnatural way that scared them the most. The council buried the story in the hollow, while the doctor kept the evidence. Between the two, the children were denied their humanity, becoming either a legend or a specimen, a myth or a medical oddity. But bone remembers, ink lasts, and sometimes fragments show up when you least expect them, forcing the past to speak again. Time went on, but stories have a way of clinging to families like burrs to wool. By the turn of the new century, many of the men who had carried the burlap bundle into the snow were gone, their names etched into stone markers on the ridge. Yet the silence they had sworn to keep did not die with them. It lingered in half-spoken words, in warnings passed from parent to child, in the haunted eyes of those who had seen too much as children themselves. One of those was the boy who had watched from behind the oak tree. He had left the hollow as soon. As he was old enough, seeking work in a distant city, yet the memory of muffled cries beneath the soil had never loosened its grip. On his deathbed decades later, far from the mountains, he told a nurse what he had seen. Fever blurred his speech, but the details were too sharp to be dismissed as delusion. He described lanterns swaying in the snow, the preacher muttering prayers unlike any he had heard before, the sound from the burlap bundle that should not have been alive. The nurse wrote nothing down. She assumed his words were, but the confession lived on in the whispers of those who heard it second-hand. The Hilton sons had their own scars. The oldest never got over his stutter. The middle child woke up screaming of digging hands, though he could never remember the dreams when he woke up. The youngest spent years in an asylum where his talk of invisible sisters was thought to be crazy. Letters found later in state archives showed that he was obsessed with setting 2 plates at every meal, as if feeding companions number. His helpers said he was harmless, but he was always talking to people who weren't there. Neighbors who had lived through that winter also had memories. An old woman remembered the midwife who never delivered another baby. Her hands were shaking until the end. A farmer's widow remembered her husband coming home from a late meeting with dirt on his boots and silence in his eyes. Each memory seemed small, but when put together, they made a mosaic of guilt, fear, and sadness. When the council's children and grandchildren were questioned, some refused to believe the story and called it a mountain legend. Others, tired of the weight being passed down like an inheritance, let words slip. They admitted that something had been done, but they never said what it was. One man, his face wrinkled with age, spoke with anger. They said it was mercy, but mercy doesn't cry in the night. The truth came out not in one revelation, but in scattered testimonies, deathbed confessions, and whispered regrets, each voice, weak and faltering, added to the chorus that confirmed what the valley had tried so long to deny. The story of the 3-headed twins was no myth spun from superstition. It was history, buried but not erased, its fragments refusing to rest. Years later, long after the hollow had quieted and the council's power dissolved into memory, the ground was broken again. It was the early 1962 when descendants, scholars, and curious locals returned to the ridge where the Hilton graves lay. Records had. After coming back to the surface, whispers turned into demands that the truth be told. When the ground was turned over, they found the mother's body, as well as clues that told a different story than the official one. Bones that were too small to be buried naturally had joined together in a way that couldn't have happened naturally, and there were pieces that clearly showed the signatures of children who had been denied for a long time. For the families who had gathered, it was both confirmation and condemnation. The truth that had been a rumor now lay in the open. Some cried openly, while others turned away. A minister prayed over the site, and his words were softer and more humble than the thunder that had once come from the same pulpit. The children, who had no names in life and were hidden in death, were finally given markers, simple stones with the words, "Daughters loved remembered." This did not change the choices of 1877, but it broke the silence that had held the community together for almost 100 years. The hollow, which had been broken by fear, started to tell its story in an honest way. The children and grandchildren of those who had acted and those who had suffered stood together for the first time to remember what had been lost. The father never lived to see this day. He died years ago in another county, and his name was written in obituaries, but the daughters were erased from history. The sons had also died, each taking their scars with them to the grave. But in the reburial their ghosts seemed to be there, lingering in the heavy air, witnesses at last to a truth that could no longer be denied. The three-headed twins in North Carolina were not signs, curses, or monsters. They were children, weak, innocent, and human. Their fate was not set by God or nature, but by men who chose fear over compassion. The story ends where it began, in the cold silence of the mountains. But now the silence is filled with guilt, carries a lesson. It makes us think about whether we would have given in to fear or let whispers decide what love should have stood up for. Those children's short lives and long shadows still ask us, will we remember or will we bury?